This is Larry Connors USA. Larry Connors USA.
George Washington knew firsthand how awful smallpox was. He caught it as a teenager during a trip to Barbados. It knocked him down for weeks. Rashes, backaches, chills, painful sores, nearly a month of sickness. According to the CDC, smallpox once killed about 30% of its victims. Survivors were usually left with scars, including young George Washington. Decades later, General Washington wrote to the President of the Continental Congress, John Hancock. He passed along concerns that the British were releasing smallpox-infected people into the population. Flat-out biological warfare.
The first such known case of biological warfare, at least documented. Those are the words of a MSNBC reporter, a host of The Week, Joshua Johnson. And it appears he's very accurate on every point he made. I want you to keep something in mind. There are some times that when you see or hear something from the state-controlled media, you think, oh, it's got to be fake. They contrived it. It has an agenda. It's not really being fully factual. I looked at his report on this, and everything I can check on it, it appears to be accurate. So don't always just simply label it depending upon the source. To that extent, PBS often has some very solid reporting. Good reporters, sometimes not so good reporters. The same person that did a good report over here maybe doesn't. But try not to just be overly judgmental and cover everyone and every event on a particular media, be it state-controlled or maybe even a conservative talk program, as being only one way. See, that's a problem I have with this program. A lot of people say, oh, well, you're conservative, aren't you? I said, I am, but I also have independent views. I have some liberal views. Well, then what kind of program do you have there? Very simple. I have a 100% patriotic program. I try to get all the views in front of you. I'm not dictating to you what to think. I'm giving you a lot of opinion on mine, things that I could not do when I was a news anchor, nor should I. News anchors should never do that if they're being a true news anchor. The problem is now you don't have such true news anchors. But let's go back to this point raised by Joshua Johnson, host of The Week on MSNBC. And he's right about Washington coming down with smallpox and then getting concerned that the British were trying to infect Americans with smallpox, biological warfare. Smallpox, according to some of the studies that are out, it goes back to the original smallpox is really not known. They didn't have the resources. They do know that they found it on Egyptian mummies. They think it's existed at least 3,000 years. It might have at one time been confused with leprosy, may have been even the same at one time. They've had various descriptions of it appearing in China. Yeah, China. And India. And then increased trade with China and India did show an increase in smallpox. The Crusades apparently spread smallpox deeper into Europe. In the 17th century, European settlers did bring smallpox to North America. But this thing about George Washington and our Revolutionary War, this is what becomes a very interesting aspect. There was an outbreak of smallpox in Boston. And at that point, Washington decided to quarantine his troops from the Boston public. That was because he did not want his soldiers coming in contact with anyone who lived in Boston because he figured they might be carrying smallpox. Well, many of the folks of Boston didn't know it. They didn't try to do it. But apparently Boston was invaded by troops from Britain, Canada, and Germany to put a stop to the revolution, the American Revolution. And in March of 76, when the British withdrew from Boston, Washington thought that they left a lot of troops behind that had smallpox to get into the city and the surroundings. They were basically, as you heard Joshua Jones say, they were trying to infect us with a biological warfare. That term, of course, wasn't really known then, but apparently that's what they were doing. The British knew what they were doing. They knew they were keeping those with smallpox or showing any indication of it from getting on the ships and going back with them, saying, stay in Boston, migrate through the country. Now, whether or not they were told you're doing it for the Queen or the British Empire, whatever they were being told at the time, it was to put a stop to this American Revolution. How dare they? Which is totally contrary, of course, to all this 1619 project, when we're told that we were fighting the revolution against the British only because we only wanted to create slavery. That should be a first and paramount issue right there, that we had nothing to do with that. But, again, back to the words of Joshua Johnson, host of MSNBC this week, and on what General Washington did.
Then, on February 5th, 1777, George Washington ordered all troops to be inoculated against smallpox. It had to be done strategically so there would still be enough soldiers to fight while their comrades healed up. And it had to be done in secret so the British would not catch on. But that allowed the Continental Army to fight on until 3.5 years after that order, the British surrendered at Yorktown. This fall marks 240 years since the Revolutionary War ended. Perhaps it could mark the end of another war, if we fight it with everything we've got. See, America's fight for freedom only began with rebellion. It ended with wisdom.
Well, it's a nice little closing statement on his behalf, and again pointing out that the right thing to do is to get the shot. Everybody should do it. Now, again, CDC Director insists that no, there will be no federal mandate. And what about troops? Generally, troops, if they're being sent to a foreign zone, they do have to have a series of shots because of the area they're going into. But if you recall, during the Persian Gulf War, Afghanistan as well, and Iran, in some cases the troops refused. They didn't know it. They didn't know how good they were. The same thing's happening now with COVID. Could be because they're young and healthy and virile, and they just don't think they're going to come down with it. Though at the current time, our military is not mandating troops get COVID-19. I'm looking at a report here that as of June 30, only about 68% of active duty troops have received at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. That's according to a report documented by the Military Times. Now, Biden has been talking about moving the military toward mandatory COVID vaccine. But as I say, with 30% or so saying we're not going to want it, it's going to be interesting to see what they're going to do. I would imagine at this rate that it may never get around to that point. Keep in mind, these vaccines, and this is a fact, they're still considered experimental. I'm not trying to put them down, not saying they're not worthy. I'm just saying technically they are considered experimental. They have not been approved by the FDA, which makes me wonder why they haven't already. And since they are still not anything but experimental and for emergency drug use only, emergency use, I should say, the military itself has said it will not make service members take the vaccine. It will not order military members to do so. Now, the issue of you taking the vaccine, be you in the military, civilian, going off to college, and maybe a college is going to demand it, or your workforce is going to demand it, or maybe you're going to get an incentive that if you will take it. To that point, While Johnson did a great job at detailing the actual history of George Washington and smallpox, then he comes to, and of course he had that little piece a moment ago about maybe we'll come away wiser from all of this. He does point out the issue of personal freedom.
Look, if you are choosing not to get vaccinated, that's your choice. Just know that our young country depended on more than firing bullets. It depended on taking shots, the kind of shots that save lives. Sick of the mandates? Tired of the restrictions? You want your freedom back? Maybe consider doing what George Washington did. Lead us out of this pandemic. And just like Washington, you can do it privately, quietly. Wouldn't want the British to find out. It's easier now than ever to get vaccinated.
That's kind of a kick or funny line. Don't want the British to find out. I told you earlier, in case you missed it, what they're doing in Australia. They have helicopters flying over parts of Sydney, telling people get back inside your home, or we'll send police over. Coming up, do you think doctors should quit calling a baby if it's a boy or girl?
You can follow Larry on Larry Connors USA Facebook. Larry Connors USA Facebook.